She was 34 years old, and by noon she had lost her trade. The rope had held while stretched straight. It failed only when it bent around the harbor capstan. A dock worker's arm was broken, a valuable engine went down into the Humber, and Silas Vane blamed the one part of that rope which had not failed, Margaret Hale's red-marked splice. Somebody up by the crane laughed. No wages, no reference, no employer on the Humber who would write her name in a book again. What she had was her father's twist gauge, a short piece of boxwood notched along one edge, cut by a man 11 years dead. 13 weeks of pay were owed her. She was given 90 days at a dead rope yard by Humber Dock instead, with the machines already chalked for scrap. But inside that abandoned ropeworks, one surviving test would show why a rope strong enough to hold 12 men had failed around a single turning drum. Before February, it would settle more than what Margaret Hale's word was worth. It would settle what every ship on that river trusted to hold. Margaret Hale had learned rope the way other children learned scripture, by hand, by repetition, and from a man who never explained anything twice. On the 17th of October, 1871, 9 men at Humber Dock were lifting a donkey engine out of the hold of a collier brig. The rope ran from the load over a block at the masthead, down across the quay, and around the barrel of the shore capstan, where 4 men walked the bars. Margaret watched the rope and not the load, because the rope was her business. She had spliced an eye into it 3 weeks earlier, and whipped the tail with red yarn, the way she marked her own work. The straight run held. It took the weight and stretched the way good rope stretches, with a creak that meant nothing at all. It was where the rope bent around the capstan that it went wrong. Margaret saw it flatten. The round of it went oval where it crossed the barrel and did not spring back on the next turn. Then the line jerked, and the engine swung 6 inches out of plumb. It knocked once against the barrel, then again, louder, then a third time, and the rope let go. The parted end came back across the quay like a dropped whip. Samuel Pike, 38, a capstan man who had worked that dock since he was 15, was thrown against the capstan head and went down with his left arm broken above the elbow. The engine dropped 11 feet into the water. A boy named Alfred Doyle, 14, ran for the doctor and was sick behind the coal office afterward. Margaret was moving toward the broken end when Silas Vane arrived. He was 47, in a black frock coat that had never been worn near hemp dust, and men stepped aside for him without deciding to. He put his boot against the red-marked splice, 30 feet back from the break, and lifted it so the men could see. "That is her work," he said. Margaret said the only thing worth saying. "The break is 4 feet from that splice." He did not answer. He had the rope coiled and carried to the Railway Street warehouse, gone inside 10 minutes, before she had put a rule on the parted end. She got one look. One strand had drawn out longer than the other 2, its fibers thin and fuzzed like a brush, and the 2 shorter strands had let go almost square. That was not what a splice failure looked like, and it was not what an overload looked like either. 2 days later, Silas held what he called an examination in the yard behind the warehouse, with a clerk present and a shipowner named Hartley Boys. 60 feet of retained rope from the same run was made fast to a ring bolt at one end and a tackle at the other. 8 men hauled it straight. It held a full minute, and the clerk wrote that the sample was sound. "You see," Silas said, "the material is not in question. Put it around the drum," Margaret said. "Run it under load, bend it, and let it turn." That is how it was working when it broke. It broke at a splice. It broke 4 feet from a splice, and the strands did not part together. Silas turned to the clerk in a way that closed the matter. The splicer's work had explained the failure, he said, and a straight proof was proof enough for any man in the trade. He never raised his voice. He never had to. She was told at the gate that her services were no longer required, and that in view of the injury to Pike and the loss of the engine, the company would not settle the 13 weeks owed to her. 15 shillings a week, 13 weeks. £9 and 15 shillings, more money than she had ever held at once. By the end of that week, the story had gone along the waterfront in the shape Silas gave it, and 3 foremen who had known her for years found reasons not to have work. She had been in rope since she was 11. Her father, Josiah Hale, was a hemp grader at a yard in Grimsby who could pull a handful of fiber, smell it, and tell you how it had been retted. In 1860, he objected in writing to short tow laid into the inner yarns of anchor cable. He was off the books in a fortnight, and nobody examined the cable. He died that October, and Margaret kept his boxwood gauge in her pocket from that year on, worn pale where his thumb had ridden it. She thought about him a good deal in the 11 days that followed. in a rented room at 2 shillings a week. On the 29th of October, a solicitor named Edward Cundall sent for her. He acted for the creditors of an estate that owned, among a great many worthless items, one covered ropewalk near Humberdock that nobody would buy. Blackthorn Ropeworks. Silas Vane had run it for 6 years and walked away in 1869, and the creditors had paid watchman's wages on it ever since. The offer was not generous. In place of her £9.15, they would grant her a supervised right to operate Blackthorn for 90 days. If she produced commercial revenue in that time, the right could be continued. If not, the equipment and the building went to the scrapmen in February, and her wage claim with them. "You should understand," Cundall said, "that this is not considered payment. It is considered a way of closing a file." Silas found her at the dock gate before she signed, and he was almost pleasant about it. "There is not enough left in that building to make a cart rope," he said. "You will be back at this gate in 10 weeks. She walked out to Blackthorn that afternoon and did not go in. She went along the outside of the north wall instead, 900 feet of dark brick, and at the far corner she crouched and sighted along it the way her father had taught her to sight a stretched yarn. The roof was broken in 4 places and the gutters were gone, but the wall ran true from one end to the other, and a rope walk that is still straight is still a rope walk. She signed on the 31st of October. She had 90 days. The doors were swollen with damp, and it took 2 of them to drag one open. Inside, the building went away from her in a single line until the far end stopped being a wall and became a gray smudge. Tall, narrow windows down both sides. A stone floor worn into a shallow trough where 2 generations of men had walked backward paying out yarn. Rope supports at even distances, some knocked flat. Dust on the turning hooks, 4 bright patches where the tiles had gone. At the far end were the winding drum, the closing top hanging on a peg with 2 grooves broken out, and the traveling carriage on its rusted rail like something that had died sitting up. Against the wall past the 3rd rope support, where the roof was still sound, somebody had left a wooden deal box and 3 short coils through 2 winters. She looked in the box. Damp paper, a bundle of tags, 2 ledgers with the covers gone soft. She moved it onto a shelf out of the wet, and did not think about it again for 11 weeks. Thomas Reed came the 2nd morning, uninvited, because word had gone around the lodging houses that somebody had opened Blackthorn. He was 42, a mechanic who had kept the machinery at 2 Hull Ropeworks running for 19 years, out of work since spring. He got down beside the traveler rail. "Bearings are dry and the rail is bent at the joint," he said. "Whatever went wrong in this trade, it went wrong in the machines. That is not where it went wrong. You have not looked at the machines. I have looked at the rope." They argued for the better part of an hour. By the end he had agreed to work for 8 pence a day and his dinner, paid when she had money, and she had agreed he would decide what got repaired and in what order. Ellen Marsh came on the 4th day and stood in the doorway a long time before she came in. She was 19, and she had prepared hemp for Silas Vane at Railway Street for 2 years until she was let go in August. Her brother Robert was 15, and still carried sacks in one of Silas's warehouses, and she said so twice, which told Margaret what she was afraid of. She went into the white yarn room at the north end and walked along the empty shelving reading it like a page. "They kept the good Riga stuff here," she said, pointing high. "2nd grade there. This end was tow." Then she stopped at the shelf ends. The paper labels had been torn off, all of them, leaving 4 small triangles under the tacks. Behind where they had hung, somebody had chalked the batch numbers onto the brick years earlier, and the chalk was still faintly there. "Somebody took the tickets," Ellen said. They did not think about the wall. Margaret wrote the numbers in a penny notebook and did not yet know what to do with them. They got the traveler moving on the 9th of November. Thomas straightened the bent rail in the tar house fire, packed the bearings with tallow because they could not afford grease, and cut 2 hardwood shoes out of a broken support. Then the 3 of them, with a dock laborer named Isaac Crowther who came for 1 day and stayed 6 weeks, pushed the carriage by hand. It moved 7 yards down the rail and stopped, and Ellen laughed out loud, the first sound like that in that building since 1869. 2 days later, Margaret got what she had wanted since October. Wilfred Sedge, 61, kept the Harbor Company's store, and the company held a retained length off every rope delivery that came onto its ground. Sedge had 22 feet from the delivery the broken rope came out of, tagged with the date, and he was near enough to his pension not to care who knew. She laid it down the floor on the 14th, made one end fast to an original anchor point in the wall, and put 12 men on the other end at 6 pence a head, 3 days of her own eating money. 12 men hauled it straight, heels braced on the stone. Nothing happened. They hauled until the rope sang and the anchor bolt groaned in the brick, and it did not part, did not neck down, did nothing except go tight and then slack. Thomas looked at her with something close to sympathy, which was worse than the argument. It held. Vane was right about the material. Vane tested it the same way. That is the whole trouble. What other way is there? The way it was working when it broke a man's arm. She had them run the identical piece around the winding drum. 2 turns on the barrel, load on one part, men on the other, Thomas turning the drum by the hand gear so the rope came onto it and off it again, the way rope lives on a capstan. For the first 20 turns it did nothing. At about 30 Ellen said, "It is going flat." It was. The round of it had gone oval where it crossed the barrel, and it stayed oval after it came off. At 40 a faint ridge stood up along one strand, running down the length like a seam. At 50 it began to knock as it came onto the drum. Once every turn and a half, uneven. Margaret stopped the drum and put her palm flat on the rope. 2 strands were cool. The third was warm, not hot, not smoking. Warm the way a horse's shoulder is warm, and only that one strand all along its length. "That is the same rope," Thomas said at last. "That is the same rope." 2 days later, a man in a good coat came up from the gate with a notebook and walked the floor, counting the turning hooks and rope supports and writing the numbers down. He was valuing the removable plant, he said, for Mr. Vane's people, and he did not need her permission. He was there 20 minutes. Margaret wrote the date and everything he counted in the front of her account book. She did not know why yet. She knew the shape of it. The rope holds when you pull it straight, and it begins to come apart when you make it bend and work. What she did next was where she went wrong, and it cost her 3 weeks and most of her money. She borrowed £4 from Ruth Otley, 39, who kept a chandlery on Blanket Row and charged a shilling in the pound, and spent £3.12 on Russian hemp that Ellen approved before Margaret would let it in the door. Then they made rope, and Margaret made it soft. She had one idea fixed in her head, that Silas closed his rope too hard to make it look dense in a coil, and that this was the sin. So she went the other way. Less twist in the yarns, an easy close. Thomas told again and again to slack the traveler. The rope came off the walk on the 2nd of December, 120 fathoms, and it looked lovely. Even, round, soft to the hand. She measured it with her father's gauge at 9 places, and it did not vary. Captain Jonah Bell came on the 4th. He was 55 and owned a coasting schooner, the Kestrel, that ran coal between Hull and the Tyne, and he had one interest in Margaret Hale, which was whether her rope would hold on his deck. "It is dry in here," he said. "Wet it and work it." They wet it with buckets, took 2 turns around the capstan in the yard, and put a load on. A man Margaret did not know watched the whole of it from the yard gate and then walked off toward Railway Street. It flattened at 8 turns. Then it began to slip, and the men had to snatch a 3rd turn on to keep the load from running away. Wet and soft, it had nothing to grip with. It crushed instead of holding its shape. Bell watched it for 4 minutes. "I will not take it," he said, and shook her hand before he went, which somehow made it worse. That night, Margaret sat on a crate with the account book on her knee. £4 borrowed, £3.12 spent. 120 fathoms she could not sell for better than mat stuff. 51 days left. Thomas sat down with the wet rope end in his hands, turning it over. "You fixed one thing," he said. "You decided the fault was hard closing, so you went soft. You never asked whether the strands were pulling even or how much twist was in the yarn before it got to the strand. You only changed the one you were angry about. I know what I did. Then write it down. All of it. Every time. You cannot hold 9 changes in your hands at once, and neither can I." She sold the soft rope for £3, 1 shilling to a halter maker at Beverley, paid Ruth Otley her interest, and started again. They opened the old rope on the 9th of December, on a plank across 2 barrels, with 3 candles and the door shut. Margaret unlaid 4 feet of it by hand, 1 turn at a time, the way her father had taught her at 12. Ellen laid out what came off it on brown paper. The first thing was that it did not want to come apart. It had been closed so hard that the strands had bedded into one another, leaving bright flattened lines down the length of every strand. That was not from the accident. That had been built into it. The second thing was the outside. The visible yarns, the ones any inspector would run a hand over, were beautiful. Long fiber, clean color, well combed. Ellen smelled a length of it and said it was Riga hemp, or as near as made no difference. Then Margaret opened a strand and took out the inner yarns. They were not the same rope. The inner yarns were short and irregular, the fiber running a few inches before it ended, with the fuzzy, broken look of tow, the leavings that come off the combs after the good long stuff is taken away. Mixed among them were fibers of another color, and down near the heart of each strand was a gray dust of broken ends, fibers already snapped, that fell onto the paper when Ellen shook it. That dust was what made Margaret sit down. Fiber does not break like that from age. It breaks from being rubbed. The third thing took Thomas to see, because it was a machine thing rather than a fiber thing. Laid side by side, the three strands were not worn alike. One was thinner, harder, glazed along its outer face, and its inner yarns were the most broken. That one was carrying the load, Thomas said, holding it against the candle. It was pulled tighter than the other two when the rope was closed, and it has been doing the work of two ever since. Margaret laid the pieces out in order, and the thing came together in her head the way a knot comes out when you find the right end. Good fiber where a man's eyes go, cheap short fiber where they do not, three strands closed under unequal tension, and the whole rope driven up hard and fast so it came off the walk looking compact and worth its price. Pull a rope like that straight, and it survives. Every part shares the strain for as long as the strain holds still, and it passes any proof a man cares to put on it. Bend it around a barrel and turn it, over and over, under load, and everything moves. The tight strand takes more than its share every time it comes onto the drum. The short inner fibers, having no length to grip with, slide, rub, and break, and the broken ends grind the ones that are left. The rope goes flat because the inside is hollowing out. One strand runs warm because one strand is doing the work. It knocks because it is no longer round. And then, some number of turns later, it separates along that strand, 4 feet from a splice that had nothing to do with it. It was made to pass a test that was not the test it had to live through, she said. Ellen had gone very still. She was looking at the tag on Sedge's retained length, and then at the notebook where Margaret had copied the chalk numbers off the wall. That number, she said. The middle 3 figures. They used those on the tow bundles. You are certain. I combed them. They came in at the back gate after 6, when the day people had gone. Mr. Hardy would take the tickets off before they went up the walk. She stopped. My brother is 15. He is in the Hedon Road warehouse. Then you have told me nothing, Margaret said. Not one word. Nothing you said today leaves this building unless you say it does. Sedge brought her the delivery papers that had come onto the harbor company's ground with that rope. They described the consignment as first-quality long hemp. It was a good night. It solved nothing at all. She still had no rope she could sell. 43 days, 3 pounds 1 shilling from the halter man. A roof with holes in it. No fiber, no buyer, and a set of facts that would sound like a dismissed woman making excuses. So she started writing everything down, which she should have done in November. The system was not clever. That was the point of it. Every bundle of hemp got a number chalked on its tag and a line in the book. Where it came from, what it cost, what Ellen said about it, whether it was dry. Every group of yarn carried the bundle's number, every strand the numbers of its yarns, every finished rope the numbers of its strands, so any rope in the building could be walked backward to the sack it came out of. Thomas built the measure. 2 pieces of ash a yard apart, fixed to the wall, a nail in each, a length of yarn stretched between. You counted the turns of twist between the nails. That was all it did. It could tell her that this yarn had 11 turns in a yard, and that one had 14, which was the argument she had been losing with herself since November. You have been trusting your hands, Thomas said. Your hands are better than mine. They are not better than a written number a stranger can check. They made 3 short ropes, 30 fathoms each, in the week before Christmas. Number 1, they closed soft, on purpose, to see the failure again on their own terms. It flattened and slipped wet at 9 turns. She wrote it in the book in plain words. Soft closing does not hold shape under a wet bend. Number 2, they closed hard, the way Silas closed. Dry, it looked the best of the 3. On the drum, it lasted 40-odd turns, then warmed everywhere and stiffened until it would hardly bend. Hard closing buys the look and spends the life. Number 3 was where the ash sticks earned themselves. They set the yarn twist by the measure and kept it the same for every yarn. Then Thomas did the thing nobody had bothered doing at Railway Street. He equalized the 3 strands before closing, hauling each to the same mark, checking twice, so all 3 went into the closing top under the same tension. It took an extra 2 hours. Silas had run 11 ropes a week. They wet number 3 on the 20th and worked it on the capstan for 140 turns under load. It stayed round. It did not slip. It came off the barrel and went back to its own shape. All 3 strands were the same temperature, and the sound it made was one sound, over and over, with no knock anywhere. Ellen wrote the entry. Rope number 3. 140 turns wet under load. No flattening. No unequal heat. No knock. Captain Bell came on the 23rd, looked at the book before he looked at the rope, and said he would take 150 fathoms of 4-inch at 11 pence the fathom, delivered by the end of January, if it would do the same in front of witnesses. It was the first order Blackthorn had taken in 26 months, £6 17 shillings and 6 pence. Silas Vane heard about it within 4 days. He did not come to the building. On the 28th of December, Ruth Otley sent a boy to say she could not supply hemp on credit after all. The merchant at the Old Harbor who had promised 1100 weight said his stock was committed until March, and would not look at her while he said it. A third dealer would not take the meeting. On the 30th, Cundall received a letter from Silas Vane's solicitors giving notice that the traveling carriage, the turning hooks, and the winding drum at Blackthorn were the personal property of Mr. Vane, installed at his own expense during his tenancy, and that he intended to send men for them. And along the waterfront a thing began to be said in offices where Margaret never went, that no underwriter would look kindly on cargo gear made under a woman's authority in a building condemned for scrap, and a careful owner might prefer to wait. Samuel Pike said something like it to her face on the 2nd of January, outside the dock gate, his arm still strapped across his chest and 11 weeks of no wages behind him. "You want to leave rope alone," he said. "You have done enough." She did not argue. She asked him one question she had carried since October, and he said he did not remember anything, and walked off. Then the roof beat her. It rained hard on the 4th and 5th of January, in through the 2 broken places over the white yarn room, and when Ellen opened the store on the 6th, 4 of the 7 sacks were wet through and had been for a day and a half. Ellen pulled a handful, smelled it, and did not have to say anything. They spread it and turned it over 3 days, and it dried unevenly and came up dull, and some had begun to heat in the middle of the sack. It would spin. That was the trouble. It would spin and look perfectly well in a rope, and nobody would know except the 4 people standing in that room. Thomas said what somebody had to say. "Half of that is still good. Take the top of the sacks, put it in the middle of the strands, and you make the captain's order and keep the building." "That," Margaret said, "is exactly the rope I am trying to prove against." She burned it over 2 evenings in the tar house grate, because heating hemp is a fire risk in a building she needed, and because the entry in her own book would have had to say what it was. That left her, on the 7th of January, with 3 good sacks, 24 days, an order she could not complete, and no supplier in Hull who would sell to her. Captain Jonah Bell had 1100 weight of Manila and Russian hemp in the Kestrel's store from a Baltic run. He came up the walk on the 8th and named his price. "You may have the lot," he said. "I want it proved on the dock. Public. My capstan, my men, harbor water, and Vane standing where he can see it. If it fails, I have lost 1100 weight and you have lost the building, and I would rather find out in January than off Flamborough Head in a gale." Ellen brought the notes on the 11th. She had kept them in a tin under her bed for 5 months. 41 pages in pencil. The dates and batch numbers of every lot of fiber she had combed at Railway Street in 1870, one with a note beside each. Long, short, mixed, dirty, wet. She had started them in March, she said, because Mr. Hardy had told her twice she was combing first grade when she was not, and she had wanted to be able to say what her own hands had touched. 3 of the numbers matched the chalk on the white yarn room wall. 1 matched Sedge's tag. 2 days later, Margaret went back to the deal box on the shelf. Inside were the Blackthorn ledgers and, under them in oilcloth, the works proof book, begun in 1858 and kept up by every operator since. It was ruled in 5 columns: batch, date, diameter, straight proof, and a 5th column, printed at the head, that said worked on drum. From 1858 to 1862 that 5th column was full. Turns counted, load noted, sometimes a line of comment in a bad hand. In 1863, when Silas took the works, the entries changed. Straight proof, straight proof, straight proof, tidy and complete. And the 5th column blank for 11 pages until the book stopped in 1869. He had not falsified it. That was what Margaret understood, standing there with the candle. He had stopped doing the test that would have told him. and gone on doing the one that would not. Sedge brought out the Harbor Company's file of proof certificates for the 1871 deliveries from Railway Street. Straight proof entered on every one. Nothing else. On the 18th of January, Samuel Pike came to the north door on his own, arm out of the strap, and stood until somebody noticed him. "You asked me if I remembered anything," he said. "I did. I have been going over it every night since October because I cannot sleep for it." He looked at the floor. It went flat first. I felt it through the bars in my hands. It went flat, and then it started knocking on the barrel. Not once, 3 times, and each one further apart than you would think. And then it went. He had told nobody, he said, because nobody had asked, and because Mr. Vane had come to the infirmary and sent his wife £2. Margaret wrote it in the book, read it back to him, and had him make his mark under it. Silas made his last move on the 23rd. His solicitors wrote to Cundall stating that no demonstration using the traveling carriage, the turning hooks, or the winding drum could lawfully take place, those being his property, and that any rope made with them was made without authority. Cundall replied in 4 lines. The creditor's grant to Margaret Hale ran to the 29th of January. Until then, the operating right, including the fixed plant, was hers, and Mr. Vane's claim would be heard afterward. She had 1 test in 6 days. They finished Bell's 150 fathoms on the 26th out of his own hemp, every yarn numbered, every strand equalized on the mark, every entry written down by Ellen. The test was on the 28th of January, at the capstan where Samuel Pike's arm had been broken 15 weeks earlier. Bell brought his mate and 4 of his crew. Cundall came with a clerk. Hartley boys came, and 2 other ship owners, and the Harbor Company sent Sedge, and perhaps 60 dockmen came because it was a cold Thursday and something was happening. Pike stood at the rail. Silas Vane came at 10 minutes past 11, stood 20 feet from the capstan in his black coat, and did not speak to anyone. There were 2 ropes on the quay, and neither had a maker's name on it. Cundall's clerk had tagged them that morning, out of sight, as number 1 and number 2. One was 30 fathoms of Blackthorn's new rope. The other was off the length Sedge had kept from the 1871 delivery. Nobody there but the clerk knew which was which. They pulled them straight first, against the shore bollards with a tackle and 20 men. Both held. Number 2 came up hard and true and stayed a full minute, and there was a murmur along the rail, because half the men had come expecting the old rope to break at once. Then they put them on the capstan. Number 1 went on first. 2 turns on the barrel, a load of pig iron on the fall, 4 men on the bars. They walked it 100 turns. It came on round and came off round and made one sound, over and over. Margaret put her hand on it at the end, then had boys do the same, and all 3 strands were the same temperature. Then number 2. It went 20 turns and did nothing. Somewhere around 30 a man near the bars said there, before anybody official had spoken, because he could see it going oval. At 40 the ridge came up along one strand, that faint raised seam, exactly as it had come up in the candlelight at Blackthorn in November. At 52 it began to knock, a small hard sound as the flattened part came onto the barrel, once every turn and a half, and it carried because nobody on that quay was talking. Samuel Pike said, "To nobody. That is it. That is the sound." At 70 turns the men on the bars felt it slip and check, and fiber dust came off it, gray and short, falling onto the wet stones in a drift you could see. Cundall's clerk knelt and swept some into a paper. They stopped it before it parted. Bell would not have a rope let go on his own dock with 60 men standing round it. Margaret had both ropes laid on the stones and opened them there, in front of everybody, with the same patience she had used in December. Nobody left. Number 2 came apart into a beautiful outside and a poor inside. Long, clean fiber on the yarns any man would see, short broken toe within, and gray dust falling out of the heart of it. One of its 3 strands was thinner, harder, glazed along its face, and warm to the hand when the other 2 were cold. Number 1 came apart the same all the way through. The same fiber outside and in, 3 strands of the same size and wear and temperature. Then Cundall read out, in a flat solicitor's voice that suited it very well, what Margaret had put in front of him. Ellen's 41 pages, with the batch numbers of the toe, the chalk numbers on the white yarn room wall, the tag on the Harbor Company's retained length, carrying one of those numbers. The delivery certificate describing the consignment as first quality long hemp. The proof certificates for those batches, straight proof entered, nothing else. And the proof book, Its fifth column ruled and headed and filled for 5 years and blank for 11 pages after 1863. Silas Vane did not say anything. He was asked a question by Hartley boys and answered it briefly, and stood where he was 2 minutes more. Captain Jonah Bell signed for his 150 fathoms on the head of a barrel, paid £3 down, and put his name to a second order for 400 fathoms of assorted sizes before the end of April, at a price that came to £19 and 4 shillings. Hartley boys said he would send a man to Blackthorn in the morning. Silas was still there when Bell signed. He watched it, then walked back up the quay past the coal office, and that was the last time Margaret Hale ever spoke to him, which she did not, because there was nothing left to say that a rope had not already said better. The creditors continued the operating right on the 4th of February. She paid herself first, because Thomas made her, and because the point was that it be written down. £9 and 15 shillings entered in the wages book under her own name with the dates of the weeks she had worked at Railway Street. Ellen Marsh went onto the books at 9 shillings a week, responsible for fibre and test entries. Thomas Reed took 12 shillings and the title of foreman, which he said he did not want, and then wrote on his tool chest. 4 people had been left unpaid when Blackthorn closed in 1869. 2 had gone to Goole and could not be found. Margaret paid the other 2 out of Bell's deposit, £3 4 shillings between them, and one of them, a woman named Hannah Toft, 67, came from Sculcoats to collect it and stayed 2 hours looking at the walk. The roof took most of the rest. 212 tiles, a new gutter on the north side, and the 2 broken places over the white yarn room closed in before the March rain. What was left bought grated fibre and a second-hand pair of spinning wheels. Blackthorn never made anybody rich. By the end of that year it had 11 people on the books and standing orders from 3 coasting owners, and there were quarters when it cleared very little. The test book stayed on a shelf by the north door where anyone who worked there could take it down, and anyone who bought rope could ask for it. Every rope that left the building carried its numbers, and every rope was worked wet on the drum before it went, and the 5th column was never blank. On a Monday morning in the middle of February, Margaret Hale, 34, out of work 4 months earlier and owed £9 15 shillings that no man on that river had expected her to see again, walked to the south end of the ropewalk with her father's boxwood gauge in her hand. She set it on the ledge at the head of the floor, where the numbers were chalked and the first hooks were turning, and left it there. Behind her, Ellen was calling the bundle numbers off the tags. The yarns came up off the wheels and went out along the walk, marked and counted, running down the length of that long, straight building, past the rope supports, into the gray light from the tall windows, all the way to the far doors, ready to be closed into the next rope.